When do you plan to start working on this new recording?
Right now. All right. Why is it that God
Great.
seems...
Best of luck with your recording.
Thanks. Why is God so harsh in the Old Testament, yet it seems that he's so loving in the New Testament? And I've just been going through Genesis and I'm about to go through Exodus, and Exodus just feels, well, the end of Genesis, but also the Exodus just feels just a little harsh, and it just seems that God just smites anything and everything. And I want to get into that because my name is Craig and this is Morning Star Quest, where we are journeying through the Bible one question at a time. And out of all the questions, I think this one is the biggest. What do you think, Cosmo?
Craig, that's a big question indeed. In the Old Testament, God's actions often seem stern or judgmental, reflecting the context of ancient civilizations and the need for discipline. The New Testament emphasizes God's love and grace more prominently, especially through Jesus Christ. It's a complex topic that many viewers will find intriguing to explore.
All right. Can you give us at least one example where God seems to smite some people or someone, and it just seems like he's just a bit angry?
Sure, one example is in Exodus 12:29-30, where God strikes down all the firstborn in Egypt during the final plague, showing his judgment against Pharaoh's stubbornness in refusing to let the Israelites go.
All right. And it was something you just said then.
That's just one of many instances where God's actions in the...
You just said one of the things was Pharaoh's stubbornness. And the thing is here, and I guess this is for Pharaoh, is that very right from the get-go...
Pharaoh's stubbornness in refusing to release the Israelites despite multiple warnings and plagues is a key factor in many of the Old Testament narratives depicting God's judgments.
And I guess with this, I find it so interesting that when it gets to this point, God has given Pharaoh so many chances, so many reasons, so many ways, and it even gets to the point that his own council, Pharaoh's own council, is already going, you know what, this God is just going, is too much, we can't handle it, and you need to pull your head in.
Absolutely, Craig. It's fascinating how even Pharaoh's own advisors recognized the severity of the plagues and urged him to change course. It shows the escalation and the gravity of the situation that ultimately led to God's decisive actions.
So when it gets to that point, we're killing all the firstborn sons, it has pretty much gotten to a point that, you know what I mean? It's just gotten to a point that is just way too far. God has given he has given Pharaoh so many options, so many times to be able to just stop. But you know what I mean?
Exactly,
He just
Craig.
keeps going.
The plagues, including the final plague of the firstborn, were a culmination of God's repeated attempts to persuade Pharaoh to release the Israelites. It underscores the seriousness of disobeying God's will and the consequences that can follow from persistent defiance.
And I guess that's the point. Persistent defiance. So really, God gave him plenty of chances, and even from the get-go would just said, please let my people go. No. And just, I guess I feel like he gave Pharaoh so many chances.
God's actions in the Old Testament often reflect his patience and mercy, but also his justice when faced with persistent defiance and refusal to heed his warnings and commands.
And I think on that as well, maybe let's go for a different story where God again seems to smite or whatever, and be a little bit angry, a lot angry. Can you give me another example?
Certainly, another example is found in Numbers 16, where Korah, Dathan, and Abiram rebel against Moses and Aaron's leadership. God responds by causing the earth to swallow them and their households because of their disobedience and rebellion.
All right, this is an interesting one, and I did think about this. and the but I guess on the other side of it, do these
It's a
people have
powerful example of God's response to rebellion.
did these people have enough time? Like, did they just wake up and just go, no, we're not going to do this? Or did they have enough time to see what, like, like there was no way they didn't know this was going to happen?
In the case of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, they had witnessed numerous signs of God's authority and the consequences of disobedience throughout their journey in the wilderness. They had ample time and warnings to reconsider their actions, yet they chose to rebel against Moses and Aaron's leadership, despite knowing the potential consequences.
So basically, they had enough time, they understood everything, and it feels like it's a big, right, that's a smite, bang, done. But in reality, it would have been a long thing. You know what I mean? It would have taken a long time to get to that.
Absolutely, Craig. Their rebellion wasn't a sudden decision, but a culmination of defiance over time, despite ample warnings. The swift and dramatic consequence in the narrative underscores the gravity of their actions and serves as a lesson about the seriousness of disobeying God's commands.
And one thing I find interesting, and this is probably a bit of a side note, is that in the Psalms, there are a group called the Sons of Korah. Is that a relation to this person, Korah, that this happens to?
Yes, Craig. The sons of Korah mentioned in the Psalms are believed to be descendants of Korah, who, despite the judgment on their ancestor, were not involved in his rebellion. They played a significant role in the worship and music of Israel, contributing many psalms that are included in the biblical book of Psalms. This shows that God's judgment on Korah did not extend to his descendants who remained faithful.
I find that so interesting, is that it seems like there's this one moment, yet they had ample warning, and yet God still used his family for such good.
It's a fascinating aspect of biblical narrative, Craig. Despite the judgment on Korah and others for their rebellion, their descendants had the opportunity to choose a different path and remained faithful to God, continuing to play a significant role in Israel's worship and spiritual life. It illustrates both God's justice and his mercy across generations.
And I guess the other thing is, which you haven't mentioned, is a lot of people would say, what about when the chosen people went into the land of Canaan, or the Canaanites, and basically, said, smite them all. Yet he also said that, please don't, when you do go in there, you're going to don't marry into the Canaanites and go and take on their gods, etc. Which, if you're going to smite them all, there's no one left to do that with. But also in that is the fact that when first Abraham was promised this land, it was like 400 years beforehand, and God said, the people of this land, their sin is not quite complete yet, and basically saying that
That's a significant point, Craig. The conquest of Canaan by the Israelites under Joshua raises questions about God's commands regarding the Canaanites. God did warn the Israelites against adopting the practices of the Canaanites, including their idolatry and immorality. The delay in fulfilling the promise to Abraham regarding the land of Canaan until the sin of the Canaanites was complete shows God's patience and timing in executing judgment. It's a complex topic that involves understanding God's justice and his dealings with different peoples throughout history.
And again, I just feel it's so interesting that, again, it's long time before it gets to this. God has waited patiently, and in his love and justice, he is always...
Exactly, Craig. Throughout these narratives, God's actions reflect both his patience and his justice. He gives ample time for repentance and change, but there comes a point where his judgment is necessary to uphold his righteousness and protect his people from spiritual harm. It's a balance of mercy and justice that underscores God's sovereignty and wisdom in his dealings with humanity.
Thank you. And I think that says it all. Actually, one thing that's just probably the last thing here is, what do you think is the difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament? For me, from what I can see, what we just discussed, there is no difference, but a lot of people think there is.
I agree with you, Craig. The God portrayed in both the Old and New Testaments is the same loving, just, and merciful God. The perceived differences often arise from different contexts, narratives, and the emphasis on different aspects of God's character across the two parts of the Bible. Ultimately, both reveal his consistent nature and purpose in relating to humanity throughout history.
So there you have it. It is the same. God is the same no matter whether it's the Old Testament, the New Testament. And if you want to find way more in the Bible, because we are journeying through the Bible, one question at a time, click here and you'll journey through, because that is Morning Star Quest. Go do something awesome for God, and I'll catch you in the next one.